Hey everyone, so in this video we are going to talk about how signal flows through a track. So that means talking about inserts and sends and returns and a little bit about pre and post fader settings for sends. Alrighty, so the first thing we usually see at the top of a track is inserts. If you're not seeing the inserts, you can go to View and Mix Window Views, and you have two sets of 5 inserts, so A through E and F through J. So a total of 10 inserts, and the same for sends. So if you're missing them, you can always put the check next to one of those to get a set. So the first thing is we can kind of picture like a audio file, or the audio from a file is coming through the top of the track and working its way down the track. So the first thing that that audio hits is anything that's inserted into the flow of that signal. So the audio comes through and inserts are applied directly to that signal. So they're what's called pre-fader, which means this fader on the track has nothing to do with what happens to those inserts. They're getting added to the raw audio that's coming from the file. You can have software or hardware applied as an insert. So what it really means is it's being inserted into the stream of the audio and they come in order. So plugins will be software things that you add. So let me just stick an EQ on here just for fun. And then say that you wanted a hardware, you would use the I/O to send the signal out your hardware through your interface, have it processed by some sort of external reverb or EQ or whatever it is, preamp, and then have it sent back to the track. So that all happens by just choosing that thing on your hardware or choosing a plugin, which I did here. So what this means is this plugin is now inserted at the beginning of the stream, and any plugin that comes after it will inherit all the changes that the previous plugin made, or any hardware made. So the signal is being changed. You might think of it like water flowing, and each of these are going to heat up the water a little bit. And each one inherits the last temperature of the water. So if this guy goes from cold to lukewarm with this 7-band EQ, then the next one is going to get the lukewarm signal and maybe heat it up more. And what happens is if you have a lot of plugins that add gain, you may start to get overages here or clipping on the track. So the signal gets boosted by adding gain with inserts. So if we just, so you can see that, I'm going to play this guitar track. And I'm just going to add some gains in the mid-range. And you'll notice that the overall meter has raised a little bit. So here's normal, and that's down there. And then if I add, you see it go up right away, right? And if I add a lot, I start to get clipping or overs. So Pro Tools gives you 2 indications of this with this top meter. So if you get clipping, which is real distortion coming off this track, it will be a red signal. And if you have an over, which just means that the signal coming out is over 0 dB, you will get a yellow meter color here as a warning. So I can't really see those colors very well, but let's just push it more. There we go. So I'm assuming that's yellow, but I could totally be wrong, but that was probably an over and not a clip, right? So clipping is especially bad. Overs are not the end of the world. And none of it is the end of the world if you like how things are sounding. So if you don't mind the distortion that might be coming from a clip because it sounds fine in the end, then, you know, don't worry about it too much. But in general, we want to avoid that stuff. And then remember, each insert in order is going to inherit the last processed signal from the previous plugin. So that means the order of these also matters. So you might get different results depending on, you know, maybe you have your EQ at the top and then you have a compressor or something. So depending on what order these two happen, you're going to get different results from the two of them because the signal is different going into the compressor if I've added gain with the EQ. So the only place that inserts are not pre-fader is on the master fader. So if you add inserts to the master fader, the fader does affect the amount of signal going to those plugins. So if you're getting overs, you can just turn the master fader down a little bit, and that should fix it. Okay, so sends don't quite work the same way. So when we have sends, you have a choice between sending them before the fader or after the fader. So what this does is send out signal to somewhere else. And that signal doesn't really come back to this track, but the signal comes out somewhere else in your mix, usually through an aux input or out some sort of other summed submix or something of that sort. So with sends, just like with inserts, you can have software sends or hardware sends. So when you have a hardware send, it goes out the output and whatever might show up. And it looks like the IO is not quite right on my current session. Let me hit my default and go back. Okay, so send. Okay, so you have whatever outputs are there for your interface. And then you also have buses, which are virtual cables that can go to other places inside that are software based or other tracks or whatever it's going to be. So we'll deal with those in just a moment. When we add a send, I'm going to do it on a bus, you automatically get a little send window that pops up. Now this is the place where you can choose whether you have your send be pre or post fader. So by default, it's off because usually if you're sending this bus out to a reverb or something, you want this fader on the track to affect how much signal is being sent to the reverb. So let's set up a situation where we do want a send to be pre-fader. So I'm going to turn pre on, I'm going to close this. And one of the nice things is you can use this, a send that is pre-fader, so ignoring the faders, right? The fader on the track, pre-fader ignores this fader. And we can use that to create a headphone mix. So I'm going to create a new track. It's going to be a stereo aux input. And I'm going to call it like Q1. So our headphone mix 1, basically. And I'm going to stick that over here next to the master. And I'm going to have the output of that not go to my regular mix. I'm going to send it out to like a virtual output. If you wanted it to go out to, say, the headphones, you need to have an output that goes out to an actual set of headphones from your interface. So you can send this. That means this is not going to the regular mix. It's going out a separate output on my interface towards my virtual, let's say, bass player who's about to track for me and needs a special headphone mix to be able to hear everything right. So we're going to create this headphone mix here on Q1. And I'm actually going to rename the send to Q1 as well. So I'm going to right click on it and then I'll get a little dialog and I'm going to call it Q1. And I need to send this guy somewhere. Right now I've got the cable plugged in here, but nothing's plugged into my aux input. So I need the input to be that bus, Q1. So now this send is plugged into the input of this aux input track. And then it's going out some special output that we're not going to hear in the main control room. And what I want to do is create levels on each instrument that I have so that they can be separate from whatever the regular mix is. So the control room will have one mix with these faders, and then these sends will have another mix for our bass player. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to command or control click on a Windows machine, and that's going to give me the expanded send view. That's kind of nice because you can get to all these. You can get to the volume, you can get whether it's pre or post fader, you can mute it, and you can pan, all with that expanded view. So again, that's command or control on a Windows machine and then clicking the arrow. If you click the name of the send, it'll just bypass the send. It'll just mute the send. So don't do it that way. Make sure you click this little arrow on the side. And then I'm going to copy these over to all the other tracks that I want to send to my bass player's headphone mix. So I'm going to hold down Option and click and drag. And that's going to, I want the bass sent to them. Actually, I don't want the bass because we don't want the MIDI bass because our bass player is going to record a new bass part, right, from our basic MIDI bass track. And then I'm going to send my piano and my drums over and my click. And now, if we just listen to this virtual output for our bass player, we shouldn't hear anything. So these guys are all up, but control room sound all the way down. right? So we're not hearing anything. And we're just going to set up a mix for the headphones for the bass player to track. So the bass player probably wants lots of drums. So we're going to turn up the drums in their mix. And we don't really care if it overs a little bit, as long as they can hear everything right. Okay, so we've got our drums going, and then we also want a little bit of the piano. And then some of the guitar. And let me start it over. Cool, and now I have a separate mix, and let's get some click in there for them too. And I think my click is off. Cool, and right now you can hear that, well, maybe you can hear that the click is on the left right now, so we can change that to be in the center if we want to. All right, so we can really customize what the bass player hears while they record with this cool cue mix. And you can do multiples of these if you want to, and do separate mixes for each musician, depending on what they need to record. So this is one of those times when we want to be pre-fader on all those sends, because we want it to ignore anything that we do in the control room on these faders. I'm going to play back the headphone mix again. If I mess with these faders, it's going to make no difference to the bass player's mix. So we can do anything we want in the control room with these volumes, and it'll have no effect on what the bass player hears while they're recording. So it's a great way to separate those two things out. So that's that, pre-fader, right? I want separate control of the volume coming out with these sends. Okay, so now let's use a send to send a reverb to a couple of our tracks. So let's put some reverb on the piano and the guitar tracks just for fun. So often what you do is you're going to create an aux input and you're going to use the same reverb for both instruments. So I'm going to make a stereo aux input again, and this one's going to be called reverb. And I'm going to hit create, and this is going to be my reverb aux input. And the input we're going to have be a bus again. Now we're already using Q1, so let's use bus 3, 4. And I'm going to rename that guy again. Oh, that was funny. That didn't work. There it goes. Okay, so I'm going to right click this guy again and rename, and we're going to call it reverb or verb. Okay, and now I want to send the guitar some reverb. So here's the bus list, and here's that verb track. Now you'll notice whenever we open up a new send that the send volume is set to -infinity. This is by design. They want this to be 0 so that say that you have some sort of gain-based thing that's adding some sort of processing that adds a lot of gain. You don't want to all of a sudden overload your system by, while listening, adding a send and suddenly having this like just blast you out of the room. So all sends by default will start at -infinity, and then you can bring them up. So we're going to make this reverb send happen, and we need a reverb on the aux input. So I'm going to grab a random reverb here, maybe just the built-in one, and let's see what we get. So again, no send so far, right? Then we bring it up. Now that's way too much reverb, but I think you can probably hear it by now, right? So say that we want that amount of reverb. We don't, but say that we want that amount of reverb on the guitar track. We can keep it that way, regardless of what we do with the guitar's volume, by keeping it post fader. So pre-fader is off, right? So that means that if I adjust this, the amount of reverb will not change, but the volume of the guitar will, right? So the volume of the guitar will change, but the amount of send, because it's post fader, the amount of send is also being changed, right? So if I lower the volume on the main guitar track, it's also lowering the send volume. So that way we get an equal amount of reverb to what we set when we heard the guitar at 0 dB. So what's really happening here is we're hearing the unreverbed audio coming out this track. And you can hear that if I solo it. So there's that reverb. So we're hearing the reverb now. I'm going to solo that guitar track. And you hear that it's totally, there's no reverb there. So I soloed that track. Well, aren't I adding processing? Yes, I am, but it's happening over here. And that processed audio is not coming back to the track. Instead, it is returned to our overall mix through the output of that track. So it's actually coming out this reverb track. So what that means is if I solo the track, I only hear the raw. Now watch, I'm going to change the fader volume here, and the amount of reverb, which is a ton, on that guitar track is not going to change if I change the volume of the guitar. Notice the send volume also dropped, right? Because it's a post fader. This is determining how much send volume we have. Now, if you have this on pre-fader, what will happen is the amount of verb will always be here. But if I change this fader, I will actually lose the raw unreverb signal from the guitar track, which will make it sound like there's even more reverb. Now I'm only hearing the reverb signal. I'm not hearing the raw. So that's the reason for post fader by default, is you really want that processing to be happening proportionally to the volume that's coming out, right? So I change this fader and the amount of send volume changes over here. And then again, raw comes out here and the return of the reverb comes out also into our main mix, but it comes out here. It doesn't come back to the guitar track. It's returned back into the session, which means that you can kind of independently control those two things, the reverb signal and the raw signal. And what's happening in the end is the raw and the reverb are being mixed to create the sound that we want. So we're actually hearing raw and reverb mixed together in the end. So it's like cold audio here, cold water here, hot water here, let's say. And then when they come out and are mixed together, they become warm. So they become just the right temperature. And then if I want to take that reverb and also give it to the piano track, again, I can copy that over by holding down Option or Alt on a Windows machine and just pull it over to the piano track. So that copies all the settings, so that send volume will also be up high there. And now we have reverb being applied to the piano track. And we don't have to use extra processing to do it. So this reverb is actually processing both of those at once. So it doesn't have to work twice as hard. It's only the one. So that's much better than having to put an insert reverb on both tracks and causing that much more processing, a duplicate processing to happen. Instead, we're just sending both signals combined over to here, and it's adding the reverb and sending it out here. Cool. So last thing you should know is when you are doing this, where you're sending reverb out from multiple tracks, and then you want to solo the track and suddenly you hear this dry signal, often you want to still be editing even though you're soloing the track. You still want to hear the reverb that's on it. So there's one other cool thing that we can do to this aux input track, and that is solo safe it. So to do that, what we do is hold down Command or Control on a Windows machine and click the solo button on the aux input. And you'll notice it grays out. That means it is now solo safed. It will stay on even if I solo these other tracks. So it's going to ignore that I'm soloing the guitar track. And what that means is I'll always get to hear this guitar track with the reverb. So we're still hearing this reverb coming out, as you might notice. So that's really nice. Otherwise, what you have to do is constantly solo both in order to hear the piano track, say, alone, but with its reverb, you'd have to solo them both. That's very frustrating after a while. So what you want to do is solo safe a lot of the time your effects aux inputs, right? So things like reverbs and delays and stuff, just solo safe them, Command or Control click them, and then that will gray out that solo button and you will still hear that aux input even when you solo the tracks. Finally, if you want to get rid of a send, you can click this arrow to the left of the send selector, or that is the send selector. So that little arrow, you can choose no send to get rid of it. So that's one way to do it. Or you can just change it if you need to just switch them. If you want to just modify, maybe, oh, I need to send it here instead, you can also click that and then reassign where the send is going. And that's that. Hopefully that all made sense, and I'll see you in the next one.